In the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, humans built the first cities, invented writing, and raised temples to gods who reflected both the wonder and the terror of the natural world. Long before Greece told tales of Zeus and Hera, or the Bible spoke of Eden and the flood, another set of stories shaped how people understood the universe and their place in it. Mesopotamian mythology is not just the oldest mythology we know of. It is the foundation beneath many that came later. Myths of cosmic battles, divine kingship, creation, and judgment. These all first appear in the clay tablets of ancient Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. But these stories are more than just origins. They reveal how early civilizations answered essential questions. Who are we? Why do we suffer? What do the gods want from us? This is the story of Mesopotamian mythology. Let's begin. More than 5,000 years ago, in a region later called Mesopotamia, something unprecedented happened. Human beings began to live together in cities, dense, organized communities with walls, marketplaces, rulers, laws, and monuments. It was here, in the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that the first great civilizations rose. With these new urban societies came a new way of seeing the world, and a need to explain it. As humans moved from scattered farming villages into city-states like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur, life became more complex. Seasonal floods threatened crops, droughts could destroy a harvest. Disease, war, and political instability were constant possibilities. In such an unpredictable environment, people looked for patterns. They looked to the sky, the river, the earth, and eventually to gods. Mythology was born not only from imagination, but from the need to understand and survive. The earliest Mesopotamian myths came from Sumer, a region in southern Mesopotamia. By around 3500 BCE, the Sumerians had developed one of the first systems of writing, cuneiform. Pressed into clay tablets with reed styluses, this writing preserved lists, laws, poetry, and myths. These stories told of gods who created the world, shaped humans, sent floods, and governed destiny. Many of the tablets found in later ruins, such as those at Nippur and Uruk, preserve versions of these early tales. One of the oldest known cities in the world is Eridu, which the Sumerians considered the first city ever built. According to a Sumerian king list, Eridu was where kingship descended from heaven, a phrase that links politics directly to the divine. Here, mythology and governance were not separate. To rule a city was to participate in a cosmic order, one defined and maintained by the gods. As cities spread and evolved, each major city in Sumer came to associate itself with a specific patron deity. Uruk belonged to Inanna, goddess of love and war. Nippur was the seat of Enlil, god of wind and divine authority. Eridu was linked with Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. These gods were not abstract ideals. They had personalities, rivalries, duties, and domains. Myths often served to explain how each god came to power or how their relationships shaped the human world. The rise of temple culture was another major influence on the development of mythology. Temples were not just places of worship, they were economic and administrative centers. Priests oversaw not only rituals, but also land management, food storage, and legal matters. These priests became stewards of myth, maintaining oral traditions and eventually recording them in written form. The stories they preserved reinforced the authority of both the temple and the ruler. Mythology helped stabilize society in a deeply hierarchical world. Kings ruled by divine sanction. Farmers and laborers worked under the watchful eyes of temple officials. The gods, in turn, were portrayed as needing human service, offerings, rituals, temples. In this exchange, everyone had a place. Even suffering and misfortune had explanations rooted in myth. A failed harvest could be a sign of divine displeasure. A victory in war might signal the favor of a city's patron god. By around 2900 BCE, Sumerian city-states were thriving, but they were not united. These cities often clashed in warfare and competed for resources. Still, they shared a cultural and religious framework. Myths moved between cities, adapted and reinterpreted along the way. Over time, common divine figures emerged across regions, even if local traditions remained strong. It is in this environment that the earliest layers of Mesopotamian mythology took form. Unlike the later codified pantheons of Greece or Egypt, the Mesopotamian gods evolved gradually through centuries of oral and written tradition. They were shaped by the needs and fears of the people, by political shifts, and by the natural environment. There is little evidence of centralized religious dogma. Instead, mythology developed in layers. First, as oral stories passed down by priests and scribes, then as texts, edited, copied, and interpreted in schools attached to temples. This process gave Mesopotamian mythology its rich complexity, and sometimes its contradictions. One of the key insights offered by these myths is the worldview of early Mesopotamians. Unlike later religious systems that emphasized divine perfection or justice, Mesopotamian deities were powerful but flawed. They quarreled, made mistakes, and changed their minds. Humans were often caught in the middle, dependent on divine favor, but never fully secure. This worldview mirrors the unpredictability of life in early Mesopotamia, where rivers could bring life or destruction, and where no political order lasted forever. The development of writing was crucial. Without it, most myths would have vanished. With it, stories could be preserved, standardized, and transmitted across generations. By the time of the Acadian Empire, in the 24th century BCE, many earlier Sumerian myths had already been recorded and passed into wider circulation. A key figure in this transition was Sargon of Akkad, a ruler who established the first major Mesopotamian empire. Though not himself a mythological character, Sargon's legacy shows how myth and power interacted. Later legends would exaggerate his origins, portraying him as a child set adrift in a basket on the river, a story that would echo much later in the tale of Moses. These kinds of narratives show how mythology served not just religious or cultural needs, but also political ones. Even as empires rose and fell, the mythological core remained influential. Later rulers and scribes did not erase earlier stories, they adapted them. The gods of Sumer became the gods of Akkad, then of Babylon and Assyria. Names changed, functions evolved. But the underlying structure, a world governed by divine forces, shaped by cosmic conflict and human duty, remained intact. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the foundation was laid. The core pantheon had emerged. Major myths had been written down. Temple complexes were vast, powerful institutions. The relationship between humans and gods, one of dependency, respect, and fear, was fully established. This was the beginning of Mesopotamian mythology, not as a fixed system, but as a living tradition shaped by its people, its cities, and its landscapes. In Mesopotamian mythology, creation was not a peaceful emergence from nothingness, but a dramatic event rooted in conflict, hierarchy, and elemental power. The cosmos, according to these ancient myths, began in a state of chaos, and it took divine struggle to shape it into the world we know. Creation was not a single act, but a series of transformative events involving primordial gods, violent clashes, and the establishment of cosmic order. These myths would not only define how ancient Mesopotamians understood the origins of the universe, but also justify the structure of their society and the authority of their rulers. One of the most significant and influential creation myths is the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian text likely compiled during the reign of Hammurabi or shortly thereafter, around the early 2nd millennium BCE. Although the story reached its full form later, many of its elements draw upon older Sumerian ideas, linking it to traditions that go back over 1,000 years earlier. This myth tells the story of how the gods were born, how they struggled for power, and how one god, Marduk, rose to the top through strength and strategy. At the beginning of the myth, the world is a formless expanse of water. Two primordial entities emerge: Apsu, the god of fresh water, and Tiamat, the goddess of salt water. Together, They represent the chaotic, undivided state before creation. From their union, a host of younger gods is born. These new deities are noisy, energetic, and disruptive, traits that echo the rising tensions in an increasingly complex world. Apsu, disturbed by the noise and chaos, decides to destroy his offspring. But his plan is discovered by one of the younger gods, Ea, also known by his earlier Sumerian name, Enki. Ea, the god of wisdom and water, acts quickly. Using a spell, he puts Apsu into a deep sleep and then kills him. Ea builds his home upon Apsu's remains, claiming dominion over the primal waters. However, Tiamat is enraged by the death of her consort. She creates an army of monsters to avenge Apsu, including 11 fearsome creatures and a new consort, Kingu, whom she appoints as commander. Kingu is given the Tablet of Destinies, a powerful object that grants supreme authority, effectively making him the ruler of gods and fate. At this point, the younger gods are paralyzed by fear. None dare face Tiamat. It is then that Marduk, the son of Ea, steps forward. Marduk is a relatively new figure in the pantheon, reflecting the rise of Babylon as a political and cultural power. He offers to defeat Tiamat on one condition: the other gods must make him their king. Desperate and without alternatives, they agree. Marduk prepares for battle. Armed with a net, a bow, and winds as his allies, he confronts Tiamat in a dramatic showdown. He traps her in his net, fills her with a storm, and shoots an arrow that splits her body in two. From one half of her corpse he forms the heavens, from the other, the earth. He then sets the stars in place, organizes the calendar, and appoints gods to rule over time and nature. Order replaces chaos. The world becomes stable, predictable, and governed by divine law. After his victory, Marduk captures Kingu and takes the Tablet of Destinies. To complete his act of creation, he uses Kingu's blood to fashion humankind. In this version of the story, humans are made not as noble beings, but as laborers, designed to bear the burden of work so that the gods may rest. This myth is dense with meaning. At its core is a justification of divine kingship. Marduk does not inherit power. He earns it through skill, courage, and leadership. His defeat of Tiamat is not only the triumph of one god over another, but also a metaphor for the transformation of nature's chaos into a world governed by law, time, and duty. It mirrors the emergence of Babylon as a powerful state capable of imposing order on a fragmented region. The structure of the divine world in Mesopotamian mythology closely reflected the structure of society. There was a clear hierarchy. At the top sat the high gods, Anu, Enlil, and Enki, who governed heaven, air, and water. Below them were other deities with more specialized roles: Shamash, god of the sun and justice; Nana, god of the moon; and Nisaba, goddess of writing and learning. Each deity had their place, just as each person in society did. Cosmic order was both a religious ideal and a political principle. Earlier Sumerian myths offer similar patterns, though with different emphasis. In these stories, the universe begins with a mingling of sky and earth, personified by the gods An, heaven, and Ki, earth. Their union produces Enlil, who separates them, creating space for life to flourish between. Enlil becomes a central figure in Sumerian cosmology, wielding control over wind, storms, and the destiny of kings. These Sumerian stories are less focused on conflict and more on separation and differentiation, the slow unfolding of order from unity. Still, they serve a similar purpose: to explain why the world exists, why the gods deserve reverence, and why humans have the place they do. Creation myths also served a practical function in Mesopotamian temples and festivals. The Enuma Elish was recited each year during the Akitu festival, which celebrated the Babylonian New Year. This was not a nostalgic ritual, but a political act. The recitation of the myth reaffirmed Marduk's authority and, by extension, the king's. In a world where political legitimacy often rested on divine favor, mythology was a tool of statecraft. There is no single canon of Mesopotamian creation myths. Different cities preserved different traditions, and local deities were often inserted into older stories. In Eridu, Enki might take on a more central role. In Nippur, it was Enlil who dominated. In Assyria, later versions would replace Marduk with Ashur, reflecting the empire's shifting centers of power. This flexibility made Mesopotamian mythology resilient. As new dynasties rose and fell, they did not discard the old myths. Instead, they adapted them, changing names, reordering events, or elevating new gods. The structure of the cosmos remained the same, but its symbolic leaders changed according to the needs of the time. Creation was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of everything else: the emergence of humans, the founding of cities, the development of law and kingship, the tension between divine authority and human ambition. In Mesopotamian thought, the cosmos was not a static place. It required maintenance. The gods had to be honored, the rituals performed, and the stories retold. Only then could order prevail over chaos. As Mesopotamian civilization matured, so too did its religious and mythological frameworks. After the early creation myths had established the world and its divine foundations, a more structured hierarchy among the gods began to take shape. At the top of this divine pyramid stood Anu, the god of the sky. His role as king of the gods reflected not only theological development, but also the growing complexity of city-states, temple institutions, and royal ideologies. Anu's name, written in cuneiform with a simple symbol resembling a star, signified sky or heaven. He was considered the source of all authority, the divine judge who governed from the highest realm. While his presence in active myths was often minimal compared to more dynamic figures like Enlil or Marduk, Anu's importance was foundational. His elevated position mirrored the high heavens, the unreachable sky dome above the world. From there, he delegated power and confirmed legitimacy. The city most associated with Anu was Uruk, one of the earliest and most influential urban centers in Mesopotamia. By the 4th millennium BCE, Uruk had become a major political and religious hub. Its massive temple complexes, particularly the Inanna precinct, were originally dedicated to Anu before eventually being reassigned to the goddess Inanna. This shift suggests how theological priorities evolved over time, but also how central Anu once was in the earliest phases of religious development. In Sumerian cosmology, Anu was part of a primordial triad: Anu, sky; Ki, earth; and Enlil, air. While the creation myths focused on the separation of heaven and earth to create space for the human world, Anu retained his role as the embodiment of the heavens themselves. His function was not just physical, but institutional. He symbolized unchallengeable authority, distant and absolute. Unlike Enlil, who often intervened directly in human affairs, Anu rarely descended from his heavenly court. His role was more judicial and supervisory. He confirmed decrees, sanctioned kings, and gave divine approval. This distance was not a weakness, but a statement of supremacy. Just as earthly kings ruled through officials and vassals, Anu ruled through other gods. His name became synonymous with authority, and divine decisions were often said to come from the mouth of Anu. One of the clearest examples of Anu's judicial role comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the gods debate how to punish Gilgamesh and Enkidu for slaying the bull of heaven. It is Anu who agrees with Ishtar's plea for retribution and allows one of the heroes to be marked for death. Even here, Anu does not act out of anger or emotion. He acts as a cosmic arbiter, upholding balance in the divine and mortal realms. Anu's authority also extended to the Tablet of Destinies, a mythical object that appeared in various myths and symbolized divine right and control over fate. Possession of this tablet granted the power to determine the course of the universe. Though other gods, such as Enlil or Marduk, were often associated with holding it temporarily, the authority behind it ultimately derived from Anu. His approval, whether direct or implied, legitimized cosmic decisions. An important development during the rise of Anu's cult was the formalization of the divine assembly, a heavenly court or council where gods debated, issued judgments, and resolved conflicts. This council reflected the political structures of Mesopotamian cities, particularly in the way rulers consulted with elders or advisors. By mirroring these earthly institutions, mythology reinforced the idea that society was a reflection of divine order. Within this assembly, Anu presided at the highest level. He was often accompanied by his offspring or divine agents, including Enlil, Enki, and a wide range of astral deities. The divine court thus became a model of structured governance, legitimizing not only divine rule, but also the power of priesthoods and kings who claimed to act on divine instruction. As Mesopotamian society evolved and empires expanded, the character and prominence of Anu were sometimes adjusted to fit new political realities. In Assyrian theology, for example, Anu was incorporated into a more militarized and centralized pantheon dominated by the god Ashur. Yet Anu's position was never erased. Even as regional gods like Marduk or Ishtar gained prominence, Anu retained his title as the highest divine authority, a kind of constitutional monarch in the celestial hierarchy. This enduring presence is also seen in the omen literature of Mesopotamia, where priests and scholars interpreted signs from the heavens to predict the future or guide decisions. Many of these texts, especially those dealing with astronomy and astrology, refer to Anu as the master of the Anu heavens, one of the three zones into which the sky was divided for observational purposes. The other two zones were assigned to Enlil and Ea. In this framework, Anu's portion included the path of the fixed stars and the most distant celestial phenomena. This division reflects a sophisticated attempt to map the sky in theological terms and assign each god a cosmic jurisdiction. Anu's continued relevance also appears in political texts and inscriptions. When kings issued proclamations or built temples, they often invoked Anu alongside other gods to validate their actions. In the Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest legal codes in history, the laws are said to have been established by the word of An and Enlil. Here again, Anu serves as the ultimate source of legitimacy. Despite his high status, Anu's mythology lacks the dramatic narratives that define other gods. He is not a warrior, trickster, or lover. He does not descend to the underworld or slay monsters. Instead, he is the fixed point from which the cosmos derives its structure. This abstract nature made him an ideal figure for theology and cosmology, even if he was less prominent in popular devotional practice. One of the few myths where Anu plays a more active role is the descent of Inanna, where he grants Inanna the me, or divine decrees and powers, that she uses to rule over aspects of civilization. Though his role is brief, it illustrates how authority flows downward from the highest source. Anu does not interfere directly but empowers others to act, a pattern echoed in the political institutions of Mesopotamia. Over time, Anu's influence extended beyond Mesopotamia. In later periods, elements of his identity would find echoes in the supreme gods of other cultures. The sky gods of the Hittites, the high gods of Canaan, and even the later conceptions of an all-powerful creator in Abrahamic traditions carry faint traces of Anu's conceptual role. These parallels do not imply direct borrowing, but they highlight how foundational the idea of a sky-bound source of divine authority was to early civilizations. With Anu reigning as the distant sovereign of the heavens, Mesopotamian mythology soon introduced another figure who played a far more immediate role in the affairs of both gods and mortals. That figure was Enlil, the god of air, wind, and divine authority. While Anu symbolized ultimate power and celestial distance, Enlil embodied active governance. He was the executor of divine will, the enforcer of order, and, in many myths, the most decisive force among the gods. He shaped destinies, granted kingship, and maintained the boundaries between chaos and civilization. Enlil's origins trace back to Sumerian tradition, where he emerges as one of the most ancient and revered deities. In Sumerian cosmology, he is the child of An, sky, and Ki, earth, and his birth marks a pivotal moment in the structuring of the universe. It is Enlil who separates his parents, splitting heaven from earth to create space in which life can flourish. This act of separation, often interpreted as the creation of the atmosphere, represents the transition from unity to order, a recurring theme in Mesopotamian thought. The meaning of Enlil's name, roughly translated as Lord Wind or Lord Air, emphasizes his role in filling the void between heaven and earth. Air was both invisible and powerful, capable of carrying life-giving breezes or destructive storms. To the Mesopotamians, Enlil was the force that moved between realms, communicating the decrees of the higher gods and enforcing them with unquestionable authority. The city of Nippur became Enlil's sacred center. Located in central Mesopotamia, Nippur was never a political capital, yet it held immense religious importance. Kings from many different dynasties, even those ruling from distant cities like Ur or Babylon, would travel to Nippur to legitimize their rule. This was because Enlil was believed to grant the divine right of kingship. Without his blessing, no ruler could claim true authority. The central temple of Nippur was the Ekur, often described in texts as the mountain house. Though Mesopotamia was largely flat, temples were imagined as cosmic mountains, links between the heavens, earth, and underworld. The Ekur stood as a symbolic axis of the universe, where the decrees of the gods were received and transmitted. The temple was also a center for scholarship and ritual, where scribes preserved myths and priests maintained the calendar through astronomical observation. Enlil's role in mythology was not limited to spiritual governance. He was also a deeply involved deity in the affairs of both gods and humans. In several myths, Enlil appears as a figure of both justice and severity. His decisions were often final and at times harsh. One of the clearest examples of this is the Mesopotamian flood myth, which predates the biblical version and appears in both Sumerian and Acadian traditions. In the flood myth, the gods decide to wipe out humanity due to its increasing noise and unruliness, a recurring concern in Mesopotamian narratives reflecting the stress of urban life. It is Enlil who leads the call for destruction. His frustration with humanity's clamor echoes earlier myths where the younger gods disturb the older order. Enlil orders the flood as a means of resetting balance. However, Enki, the god of wisdom, defies this command and secretly instructs a human, Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, and Utnapishtim in the Acadian epic of Gilgamesh, to build a boat and save life from annihilation. The conclusion of this myth reveals an important balance within Mesopotamian theology. While Enlil represents law and divine judgment, Enki embodies compassion and adaptability. After the flood, Enlil's anger subsides, and he accepts the continued existence of humanity, even granting immortality to the flood survivor. This interplay between stern authority and merciful wisdom is a recurring dynamic throughout Mesopotamian religious thought. Enlil also appears prominently in the Epic of Gilgamesh, though more as a background force than an active participant. After Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the monster Humbaba, who guards the cedar forest, the gods are angered. Enlil had appointed Humbaba as guardian, and his death is seen as a disruption of divine order. Enlil decrees that one of the two heroes must die as punishment, leading to Enkidu's tragic fate. Again, Enlil acts not out of personal vendetta, but as the enforcer of divine law. His concern is with preserving balance and respecting roles. One of the more complex aspects of Enlil's character is his relationship with humanity. Though he is the one who grants kingship and ensures societal stability, he also demands obedience and punishes disobedience harshly. In this way, Enlil reflects the dual nature of institutional power. It offers structure but expects submission. To offend Enlil was to challenge the very order of the cosmos. Yet Enlil was also honored as a benefactor. Hymns praise him as the father of the gods, the shepherd of the lands, and the Lord who decrees fates. Farmers would pray to him for favorable weather, just as kings would seek his favor for military success. His cult was not feared alone, it was respected and sustained across centuries. His epithets reveal his layered nature. He could bless or curse, nourish or destroy, build or unmake. Over time, as political centers shifted, other gods rose in prominence. In Babylon, Marduk would eventually supplant Enlil as the chief deity, especially during the 2nd millennium BCE. Yet even then, Marduk's rise involved a theological negotiation. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk receives 50 names, many of which were originally titles of Enlil. This act did not erase Enlil, but subsumed his authority into a new imperial structure. It reflected the continuity of myth through adaptation rather than replacement. In later Assyrian religion, Enlil remained significant, although overshadowed by Ashur, the national god of Assyria. Still, in temple libraries and ritual texts, Enlil's name persisted, often invoked alongside Anu and Ea, Enki, as part of a divine triad. This enduring presence shows how foundational his role was to Mesopotamian identity. Enlil's mythology also influenced the broader region. The idea of a high storm god who grants kingship and punishes rebellion appears in Hittite, Hurrian, and even early Canaanite religion. Scholars have drawn comparisons between Enlil and later figures such as El in Ugaritic texts or Yahweh in early Israelite traditions. Though these connections are complex and debated, what is clear is that Enlil's role as a moral enforcer and grantor of kingship set a pattern that others would follow. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the universe was never static. It required constant maintenance through ritual, sacrifice, and obedience. Enlil, as the god of breath and storm, symbolized this constant movement. He was the wind that carried divine decrees across the world, and the storm that reminded humans of their limits. While Enlil ruled with stern authority and divine law, another figure within the Mesopotamian pantheon offered a different kind of power, subtle, clever, and often unpredictable. This was Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, magic, and creation through intellect. Also known as Ea in later Acadian texts, Enki brought balance to the more rigid forces of order represented by Anu and Enlil. Where others commanded with storm and decree, Enki worked through knowledge, strategy, and insight. Enki's domain was the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that the Mesopotamians believed existed beneath the earth. This was the source of all life-giving water, from rivers to springs. The Abzu was not only physical, but metaphysical, a space of origin and potential. Enki's association with this deep reservoir made him both a literal and symbolic figure of fertility, invention, and the mysterious currents of life. His principal cult center was the city of Eridu, regarded by Sumerians as the oldest city in the world. Texts describe Eridu as the first place where civilization emerged and where kingship was established after descending from heaven. Archaeological evidence supports the antiquity of the site, showing layers of continuous habitation stretching back to the Ubaid period, over 6,000 years ago. The temple dedicated to Enki, known as the Abzu, or House of the Deep Waters, was one of the earliest monumental religious structures in Mesopotamia. Unlike Anu and Enlil, whose authority was rooted in hierarchy and command, Enki's power came from his divine decrees or principles that governed all aspects of the cosmos and human society. These were not laws in the legal sense, but fundamental patterns of existence, concepts like kingship, wisdom, weaving, judgment, joy, and even fear. According to the Sumerian myth of Inanna and Enki, these were stored in Enki's possession, and he alone had the ability to distribute them. In the tale, Inanna, the goddess of love and war, visits Enki in Eridu. She flatters him, gets him drunk, and persuades him to give her the She quickly escapes with them to her city, Uruk. When Enki sobers up and realizes what has happened, he sends servants to retrieve the stolen But Inanna cleverly fends them off and succeeds in bringing the divine powers to her city. Though Enki was initially angry, the myth ends with him allowing her to keep them, symbolizing the legitimate transfer of divine functions to Uruk. This story is important not only for its lively depiction of divine interaction, but also for what it reveals about Enki's character. He is not a tyrant or a jealous god. He is capable of being outwitted and, crucially, of recognizing when to accept change. Enki's flexibility and willingness to yield stand in contrast to Enlil's often unbending nature. His wisdom includes the ability to adapt, to compromise, and to respect cleverness in others. In other myths, Enki serves as a protector of humanity. When the gods decide to destroy humankind in the flood myth, it is Enki who secretly warns the chosen human, Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, breaking the divine agreement of silence. He instructs the human to build a great boat and save animals and family. This act of disobedience is not portrayed as betrayal, but as compassion. Enki sees value in preserving life, even when divine law demands its end. He works behind the scenes to soften the harsh decrees of the cosmos. Enki's role in creation myths is equally vital. In several traditions, he is credited with creating humankind from clay, often with the assistance of a mother goddess, such as Ninhursag or Aruru. In one version, the gods are overwhelmed with labor and complain to Enki, who devises a solution: the creation of human beings to carry out work on behalf of the gods. This practical purpose reflects the Mesopotamian view of humanity's role, not as divine equals, but as servants needed to maintain divine order through ritual and labor. Yet Enki does not merely create humans and abandon them. He continues to shape their world through his inventions. In various hymns and texts, Enki is described as the bringer of irrigation systems, agriculture, writing, and crafts. His wisdom is technical and transformative. He is the architect of civilization, not through war or conquest, but through planning and innovation. A particularly notable myth involving Enki is the tale of Enki and Ninhursag, which explores themes of fertility, balance, and restoration. In this story, Enki consumes a series of sacred plants and impregnates various goddesses, ultimately violating the balance of nature. As a result, Ninhursag curses him, and he falls ill with ailments in various parts of his body. Eventually, Ninhursag returns and gives birth to healing deities for each afflicted part, restoring him to health. The story is both comic and moral, showing Enki's capacity for error and the necessary role of feminine wisdom in restoring harmony. Enki's influence was not limited to Sumerian tradition. As the Acadians and later Babylonians inherited and adapted these myths, Enki's name changed to Ea, but his core attributes remained. In the Enuma Elish, it is Ea who defeats Apsu, the god of freshwater chaos, and builds his temple upon the subdued primordial waters. He becomes the father of Marduk and sets the stage for his son's rise to cosmic kingship. Even here, Ea is a kingmaker, working behind the scenes to ensure balance and stability. In the field of divination and magic, Enki's role was also prominent. He was seen as the patron of incantations and purification rituals. Priests would invoke him in ceremonies meant to cleanse illness, ward off evil spirits, or ensure fertility. His name appears frequently in the series of exorcistic texts used in temples and homes throughout Mesopotamia. He was not only the god of cosmic structure, but also the god people turned to in times of personal crisis. What sets Enki apart from other gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon is his consistent role as a mediator. Whether easing tensions between deities, circumventing destructive decrees, or helping humanity survive, Enki worked within the system to bring resolution. He did not rebel or overthrow, but subtly reshaped situations to favor life, adaptability, and growth. This characteristic made him a deeply respected figure, especially among scribes, healers, and scholars, those who, like Enki, worked through intellect and craft. His image was often depicted with flowing streams of water emerging from his shoulders, symbolizing the nourishing wisdom he bestowed upon the world. In Mesopotamian mythology, the origin of humanity is not wrapped in sentimentality or divine affection. Rather than being created in a state of divine image or moral perfection, humans were shaped for a pragmatic, even burdensome purpose: to serve the gods. This idea, central to the Mesopotamian worldview, was not framed as cruelty, but as necessity. The gods, powerful though they were, had grown weary of labor. The solution was to delegate that work. Humanity was the answer. Several Mesopotamian myths address the creation of humans, and while details vary between Sumerian, Acadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian versions, the underlying themes remain consistent. Humans were made to relieve the gods of toil, to perform sacrifices, to maintain temples, and to uphold the cosmic order through ritual and obedience. One of the earliest references to the purpose of human creation appears in the Sumerian myth, The Creation of Man, in which the lesser gods, called the Igigi, are assigned the task of digging irrigation canals and working the land. For a time, they endure the burden, but eventually they rebel, throwing down their tools and surrounding the house of Enlil, demanding relief. Rather than punish them, the high gods, led by Enlil and Enki, respond with a compromise: create a new race that will assume the labor. Here, Enki plays a central role, using clay, mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain divine being, to fashion the first humans. In some versions, the goddess Ninhursag, or Aruru, assists in this act, serving as a divine midwife or creator mother. The involvement of both male and female deities underscores the dual nature of the task: practical and reproductive, technical and nurturing. The Babylonian Enuma Elish offers a more politically charged version of this event. After the warrior god Marduk defeats the chaos goddess Tiamat, he takes her consort Kingu, who had led her army and held the Tablet of Destinies, and executes him. From Kingu's blood, mixed again with clay, Marduk forms humanity. This origin links human nature directly to rebellion, sacrifice, and divine conflict. Humans are thus not only created to serve, but they carry within them the trace of divine disobedience. This recurring theme, that humans contain both clay and divine essence, is foundational to Mesopotamian anthropology. It suggests that people are inherently bound to the earth, mortal and flawed, but also touched by something sacred. Yet this sacredness is not a mark of elevation, it is a reminder of obligation. Humans must continually justify their existence through loyalty to the gods and fulfillment of their duties. In the Epic of Atrahasis, a much more detailed account of human creation and early human history emerges. In this Acadian narrative, the Igigi again rebel against the hard labor imposed upon them. Enki proposes creating humans, and the gods agree. A god is sacrificed, his blood mixed with clay, and humans are born. But soon after, their population grows too large. Their noise disturbs Enlil, echoing earlier myths in which divine irritation leads to destruction. A series of plagues, droughts, and ultimately the Great Flood are unleashed to reduce their numbers. Here again, humanity's purpose is tied to both service and limitation. They are meant to labor, not to flourish without restriction. The gods are not interested in human autonomy or prosperity beyond what serves divine needs. When humans grow too loud, too many, or too self-sufficient, divine wrath follows. Yet Enki, as in other stories, emerges as a more sympathetic figure. In Atrahasis, he secretly warns the titular hero to build a boat and survive the flood, preserving life while respecting divine decrees. This subtle defiance reflects an underlying complexity in the gods' attitudes toward humanity. While Enlil often represents cosmic balance through strict enforcement, Enki provides a counterbalance, protecting humanity from extinction. Notably, the myths of human creation rarely dwell on individual origin stories or moral testing. There is no fall from grace, no Edenic innocence lost. Instead, humanity begins in a condition of obligation, with myths emphasizing the collective rather than the individual. This reflects the broader Mesopotamian worldview, in which society and hierarchy, rather than personal salvation or sin, structured human life. Temples, for example, were not merely places of worship. They were centers of economic production, education, and administration. The labor performed there by priests, scribes, workers, and attendants was seen as fulfilling humanity's created purpose. Daily rituals, offerings, and processions were not optional displays of faith. but essential functions that kept the divine and mortal worlds in alignment. Mesopotamian kings, too, saw themselves not as divine beings, but as appointed caretakers of this sacred order. Many royal inscriptions describe the king as a shepherd chosen by the gods to build temples, uphold justice, and defend the land. These acts were not only political, but cosmological. Kingship itself was a divine function meant to organize and sustain the world. Without humans to maintain the temples and kings to enforce law, the world would descend into chaos. In this context, myths about human creation also served as political ideology. They justified the stratification of society. If humans were made to serve the gods, and if kings ruled by divine appointment, then social inequality could be seen as natural, even necessary. Slavery, corvée labor, and temple servitude were not merely tolerated. They were embedded in the theological logic of the world. Despite this utilitarian vision of humanity, Mesopotamian texts do show glimpses of empathy and reflection. In lamentations and wisdom literature, humans plead with the gods for mercy, express sorrow at mortality, and question the justice of suffering. These texts suggest that, while mythology explained humanity's subordinate place, it also gave voice to their longing for meaning, fairness, and divine attention. In one poignant Sumerian poem, a man cries out, "The god gave me sickness and took away my strength. I called to him, but he did not hear me." These expressions of vulnerability show that mythology was not only a tool of control, but also a language of spiritual engagement. It allowed people to wrestle with divine silence, to seek answers within a system that often seemed distant and unyielding. Even the gods were not entirely indifferent. In many myths, their relationships with humans are marked by complexity, moments of protection, forgiveness, or even affection. When the gods decide not to destroy humanity after the flood, it is a sign not just of appeasement, but of recognition that human life, however flawed, carries value. The gods may have created humans for labor, but they are not merely tools. They are participants in a fragile, sometimes perilous, but ongoing relationship with the divine. The spiritual architecture of Mesopotamian mythology was not confined to mythic texts or celestial drama. It was built into the cities themselves, into the bricks, streets, ziggurats, and temple complexes that dotted the river plains. For the people of ancient Mesopotamia, the divine was not an abstract force floating above the world. It was present, active, and most importantly, localized. Every major city had a patron deity, and every temple was considered a dwelling place for the gods, not just a symbolic shrine. This fusion of urban life and divine presence shaped the identity of Mesopotamian city-states. Religion was not a separate sphere. It was the framework through which politics, economics, and society functioned. Mythology justified city foundations, explained dynastic legitimacy, and provided the rituals through which daily life was ordered. Sacred cities and temples were the material anchors of the mythological worldview. Among the earliest and most revered of these cities was Eridu, considered by later Sumerians to be the first city ever created. As the seat of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, Eridu held deep spiritual significance. According to Sumerian king lists and hymns, kingship first descended from heaven to Eridu. This phrase encapsulates the Mesopotamian belief that legitimate rule and social structure originated not from human achievement, but from divine intention. The temple of Enki at Eridu, the Iabzu, stood over what was believed to be the entrance to the subterranean waters. This sacred connection to the Abzu made the temple a liminal space, a boundary between the physical world and the divine realm. The temple complex was not merely a site of worship. It was a center of knowledge, ritual purity, and cosmic balance. As civilization expanded, other cities also established themselves as religious centers, each with its own divine patron and mythology. Uruk, for example, became the domain of Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and political power. Her temple, the Inanna, was among the largest and most elaborately maintained in ancient Mesopotamia. Texts describe it as a place of celebration, fertility rites, and royal ceremonies. Nippur, though never a political capital, held unparalleled religious status due to its association with Enlil, the god of air and divine authority. Kings from other cities, including Ur and Babylon, would travel to Nippur to seek Enlil's blessing, without which their rule was considered illegitimate. Nippur's temple, the Akur, meaning mountain house, was imagined as a cosmic center, connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld. Each city's identity was deeply tied to the character of its patron deity. Ur, known for its moon god Inanna, was a center of astronomical observation and calendar regulation. Its great ziggurat, constructed under the reign of Ur-Nammu in the 22nd century BCE, served as both a religious and administrative hub. The ziggurat's layered terraces symbolized the ascent from the earthly realm to the heavens, and were often imagined as stairways for the gods themselves. These temples were not passive monuments. They were living institutions, supported by vast land holdings, staffed by priests, musicians, scribes, bakers, and craftsmen, and engaged in trade, storage, and production. Offerings were made daily, festivals held regularly, and rituals performed with precision. This ongoing activity ensured that the gods were housed, fed, and honored properly. If neglected, the myths warned, divine displeasure would follow, through droughts, invasions, or plagues. The functioning of a temple was governed by detailed regulations. The temple hymns, a set of Sumerian texts attributed to the high priestess Enlil, describe the glories and responsibilities of various temples across the land. These hymns are not only devotional poetry, but also geographical and theological documents, mapping the religious landscape of Sumer and beyond. Enlil, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, played a particularly influential role in shaping temple theology. As high priestess of Inanna in Ur, she combined Sumerian and Acadian traditions, writing hymns that elevated Inanna's status and established a model for priestly authority. Her writings represent one of the earliest instances of personal authorship in recorded history, and they reveal the central role of temples as political and literary centers. Temples also served as repositories of myth. Clay tablets discovered in temple libraries, such as those at Nineveh and Sippar, contain epic poems, hymns, medical texts, and divination manuals. The famous library of Ashurbanipal, assembled in the 7th century BCE, included thousands of texts, many of which were copies of older Sumerian and Babylonian materials. Without these temple archives, much of Mesopotamian mythology would have been lost to history. The physical layout of a temple often followed cosmological principles. The inner sanctum, where the deity's statue resided, was believed to be the most sacred space. Only high-ranking priests could enter it, and its purity was protected through elaborate cleansing rituals. The statue of the god or goddess was not a symbol, but a living embodiment. It was washed, clothed, and fed daily. Festivals involved parading the statue through the city, symbolizing the deity's presence and participation in communal life. One of the grandest of these festivals was the Akitu, the Babylonian New Year celebration. During Akitu, the statue of Marduk was taken from his temple, the Esagila, to a separate house outside the city, symbolizing his death and return. The ritual reenactment of the Enuma Elish creation myth was central to this festival. Through this annual event, the cosmos was renewed, kingship reaffirmed, and the bond between God and people re-established. It is important to understand that temples were not isolated religious sites. They stood at the heart of city life, both geographically and ideologically. The temple was often the largest structure in the city, dominating the skyline with its ziggurat. Its influence extended to law, education, agriculture, and diplomacy. Temple economies managed large tracts of farmland, oversaw production and trade, and stored grain reserves for times of famine. This integration of the divine into the daily life of the city shaped how Mesopotamians thought about their place in the world. To live in a city was to live under the protection and scrutiny of a god. Every wall, every gate, every public space was infused with sacred meaning. Even the act of rebuilding a city after conquest or flood was a religious task. The reinstallation of a god statue marked the restoration of divine favor. Without the god, the city was spiritually abandoned. Throughout Mesopotamian history, this model of divine urbanism remained remarkably stable, even as political power shifted from Sumerian to Acadian to Babylonian to Assyrian hands. Conquering kings would often show piety by restoring temples, repairing ziggurats, or returning sacred objects. These acts were not only diplomatic, but deeply theological. They reaffirmed the cosmic order and demonstrated the king's loyalty to the divine world. Even when empires fell and cities were abandoned, the memory of these sacred spaces endured. Later cultures, including Persian, Greek, and even Islamic rulers, recognized the religious prestige of sites like Babylon and Ur. Though the gods themselves were no longer worshipped in the same way, the idea of the city as a reflection of divine order persisted. Among the many deities of Mesopotamian mythology, none stood out with such vibrant complexity and symbolic power as Inanna, known as Ishtar in the Acadian tradition. She was the goddess of love and war, fertility and destruction, beauty and political ambition. Her myths were rich with tension and transformation, offering one of the most dynamic portraits of divinity in the ancient world. Inanna's stories were not passive tales of creation or distant authority. They were emotionally charged, socially engaged, and deeply reflective of human experience. Inanna's origins trace back to Sumerian religion, where she appears as one of the earliest attested deities. She was the patron goddess of Uruk, a city of cultural and political significance. Her temple, the Inanna, meaning House of Heaven, stood as a major center of worship, and her presence in hymns and mythological texts shows that her cult was both deeply respected and widely influential. In her earliest characterizations, Inanna was associated with fertility, sexuality, and the life force. Unlike the more nurturing mother goddesses found in other ancient traditions, Inanna's version of fertility was inseparable from intensity and desire. She did not represent passive growth, but active pursuit and confrontation. In Sumerian hymns, she is described as storm-like, overwhelming, and irresistible. One of her most famous myths, the Descent of Inanna, offers a powerful narrative of transformation and duality. In this story, Inanna descends into the underworld, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. Before her journey, she removes her divine attributes, known as Mi, and instructs her servant Ninshubur to seek help from the gods if she does not return. As she passes through the 7 gates of the underworld, she is forced to give up a piece of her clothing or power at each gate until she stands naked and powerless before Ereshkigal. This stripping away is rich in symbolism. Inanna, the goddess of life, must confront death not as a conqueror, but as a vulnerable being. When she reaches the throne room, Ereshkigal strikes her down. Inanna is hung on a hook and left there for 3 days and 3 nights, a duration symbolizing cosmic imbalance. Eventually, the god Enki intervenes, creating 2 genderless beings who descend into the underworld and empathize with Ereshkigal's suffering. Moved by their compassion, Ereshkigal grants them Inanna's lifeless body. They restore her to life with food and water of resurrection. However, no one leaves the underworld without substitution, and Inanna is told she must send someone in her place. When she returns to the world above, she finds that her consort, Dumuzi, has not mourned her. He is dressed in fine clothes and seated on her throne. Enraged, she chooses him as her substitute. The demons of the underworld seize him, dragging him down. Eventually, through the pleading of Dumuzi's sister, Geshtinana, a compromise is reached. Dumuzi and Geshtinana will alternate periods in the underworld, marking the seasonal cycles of death and renewal. This myth is significant on multiple levels. On the surface, it is an explanation of seasonal fertility similar to the Greek myth of Persephone. But more deeply, it is a story of power, gender, identity, and sacrifice. Inanna's journey is not only physical, but existential. She faces disintegration and returns transformed. The myth also elevates the idea of descent and return as a universal process linked to agriculture, human suffering, and even political transitions. Inanna's dual nature, both nurturer and destroyer, is further explored in texts describing her as a warrior goddess. In Sumerian and Acadian hymns, she is praised for her role in battle. She rides into war with lions and storms, terrifying enemies and granting victory to her chosen rulers. One poem declares, "She dances among the sword blades like fire." Her warlike character was not seen as contradicting her sexual identity, but as an extension of her power to initiate, dominate, and renew. As Inanna evolved into Ishtar in the Acadian-speaking regions, particularly in Babylon and Assyria, her attributes were further expanded. Ishtar became a national deity, especially in Nineveh and Arbela, where her cult took on a more martial and imperial tone. Assyrian kings, such as Ashurbanipal, regularly invoked Ishtar before military campaigns, and inscriptions describe her as Queen of Heaven and Lady of Victory. Despite her immense power, Inanna Ishtar remained deeply human in her emotions. In various myths, she experiences love, jealousy, rage, sorrow, and longing. Her relationships, particularly with Dumuzi, are filled with complexity. In one poem, she seduces Dumuzi with vivid and sensual language, emphasizing physical desire and romantic partnership. Yet in other stories, she betrays him or uses him as a tool for divine justice. These tensions reflect the Mesopotamian understanding of the gods as emotionally complex and morally ambiguous. Inanna's myths also had strong political implications. Her divine authority was often invoked to support kingship. In some texts, she is described as bestowing the rod and ring of power, a symbol of legitimate rule. The kings of Uruk, including the semi-legendary Gilgamesh, claimed her favor. The idea that a king must earn or maintain the love of Inanna symbolized the reciprocal relationship between ruler and divine order. She could grant kingship, but she could also revoke it. Perhaps the most profound contribution of Inanna's mythology is her challenge to fixed boundaries between life and death, male and female, war and peace, love and hatred. In her descent, she crosses into the realm of death. In some texts, she dons masculine armor. In others, she feminizes the warrior's role. In rituals and hymns, her followers invoked her in moments of transition, whether personal, agricultural, or political. Her legacy continued well into later periods. Even as Babylonian and Assyrian empires rose and fell, the worship of Ishtar endured. The name Ishtar likely influenced the later Semitic term Ashtoreth in Canaanite religion, and there are possible connections, though not direct equivalents, to later goddesses such as Aphrodite or Venus. Yet unlike those later figures, Inanna Ishtar never shed her martial and destructive aspects. She remained a goddess of contradictions. Archaeological finds, such as statues, reliefs, and inscriptions, further attest to her popularity. Small clay figurines of nude female figures, often associated with fertility and eroticism, are commonly found in domestic and temple contexts. Larger monuments portray her with weapons, lions, and royal symbols. The diversity of these images reflects the broad and layered character of her worship. Even in the realm of personal devotion, Inanna Ishtar played a vital role. Women prayed to her for fertility, men invoked her for protection in battle, and rulers sought her favor for conquest. Her temples were among the richest and most powerful institutions, and her rituals, including sacred marriage ceremonies, linked divine fertility with political legitimacy. Among the many figures in Mesopotamian mythology, few stand as tall, both literally and symbolically, as Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king of Uruk. His story, preserved in one of the oldest known works of literature, is not just a tale of adventure, but a meditation on kingship, friendship, mortality, and the limits of human power. The Epic of Gilgamesh bridges the realms of myth and history, embodying the values, anxieties, and aspirations of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Gilgamesh appears in the Sumerian king list as a ruler of Uruk who reigned in the early 3rd millennium BCE. Though the king list presents him as a historical figure, his portrayal in literature is far more mythic. He is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a being of extraordinary strength and beauty, born of the goddess Ninsun and a mortal father, Lugalbanda. This divine heritage marks him as exceptional but also alienated. He belongs to both worlds, yet is fully at home in neither. At the beginning of the epic, Gilgamesh is not a hero in the moral sense. He is a tyrant. His people cry out to the gods for relief, lamenting his arrogance and abuse of power. In response, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man fashioned from clay, to confront Gilgamesh and balance his excesses. Enkidu lives among animals and has no knowledge of civilization. His transformation begins when he encounters a temple prostitute, Shamhat, who teaches him about human customs, food, clothing, and intimacy. The episode with Shamhat is crucial. It shows how civilization in Mesopotamian thought is not only about structures and rules, but about relationships, rituals, and social integration. Through his union with Shamhat, Enkidu gains wisdom but loses his primal innocence. He becomes human. When Enkidu arrives in Uruk, he challenges Gilgamesh to a wrestling match. Their battle shakes the city but ends in mutual respect. This confrontation marks the beginning of one of the most enduring friendships in ancient literature. Gilgamesh, once isolated by his power, finds in Enkidu a companion who shares his strength and understands his soul. The theme of friendship, especially between two men of immense but different strengths, becomes the emotional heart of the epic. Seeking to make a name for themselves, the two heroes embark on a dangerous quest to the cedar forest, guarded by the monstrous Humbaba. This journey is both physical and symbolic. It represents the heroic impulse to confront the unknown, to achieve greatness beyond the confines of one's city or lifetime. Despite warnings from elders and gods alike, they proceed, and with the help of the sun, god Shamash, they defeat Humbaba. Yet their victory comes with consequences. Humbaba had been appointed by the gods to protect the forest. By killing him, Gilgamesh and Enkidu disrupt the divine order. Their actions are bold, but also reckless. This theme of heroic deeds that invite divine punishment recurs throughout Mesopotamian myth and serves as a cautionary frame for the epic. After returning to Uruk, Gilgamesh attracts the attention of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. She proposes marriage, but Gilgamesh refuses, recounting the tragic fates of her former lovers. Insulted, Ishtar ascends to heaven and demands that her father, Anu, release the bull of heaven to punish him. The bull brings devastation to Uruk, but Gilgamesh and Enkidu slay it, further angering the gods. This act of defiance is the turning point of the story. The gods convene and decree that one of the two must die. Enkidu, the more mortal of the pair, falls ill. His death is slow, painful, and filled with lamentation. In the final days of his life, Enkidu curses the trapper who discovered him and Shamat who civilized him. But after a dream reveals the justness of their roles, he blesses them, acknowledging the human world he had entered. Gilgamesh's grief is profound. He tears his garments, wanders the wild, and refuses to bury Enkidu until his body begins to decay. This raw portrayal of loss marks a dramatic shift in the narrative. The hero who once sought glory now fears death. Enkidu's passing shatters his sense of immortality and drives him to seek the only man who has escaped death, Utnapishtim, the flood survivor. Gilgamesh's journey to find Utnapishtim is a descent into the unknown. He travels beyond the edges of the world, through mountains and across the sea. Along the way, he meets Siduri, a tavern keeper who urges him to accept human limitations and find joy in daily life. She tells him, "Fill your belly with good things. Let joy be your feast, your clothes be fresh." This advice, echoing later philosophies of contentment, does not satisfy Gilgamesh. He presses on. When he finally meets Utnapishtim, he learns the story of the Great Flood, a tale closely related to the later biblical account of Noah. Utnapishtim explains how the gods decided to destroy humanity, but were persuaded by Ea, Enki, to spare a remnant. Utnapishtim and his wife were granted immortality as a unique exception, not a model to follow. No human, he tells Gilgamesh, can escape death. It is the fate of all. Still, Utnapishtim offers a test. If Gilgamesh can stay awake for 7 days and nights, he may gain immortality. Gilgamesh fails almost immediately. Utnapishtim's wife then urges her husband to reward the weary king with a parting gift, a plant that restores youth. Gilgamesh finds the plant, but loses it to a serpent while bathing. This final disappointment brings his journey full circle. Returning to Uruk, Gilgamesh looks upon the walls he helped build. He takes pride not in his conquests, but in his city, his people, and the lasting work of civilization. The epic ends not with divine triumph, but with a recognition of human limitation and achievement. The Epic of Gilgamesh is more than a hero's tale. It is a philosophical exploration of what it means to be human. It asks timeless questions. What is the purpose of life? How should we respond to death? What gives meaning to power, friendship, and legacy? In the context of Mesopotamian mythology, the story also reflects the ideals and anxieties of kingship. Gilgamesh is both a model and a warning. He begins as a tyrant, finds wisdom through suffering, and returns not with godhood, but with understanding. His journey mirrors the arc of responsible leadership, one that recognizes its limits and duties. Historically, the epic was copied and studied for centuries. Versions have been found in Sumerian, Acadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian tablets. It was taught in scribal schools and recited in royal courts. Its survival into modern times, despite the fall of its civilization, speaks to its enduring power. Among the many mythic themes that spread far beyond Mesopotamia, few are as enduring or universally recognizable as the story of a great flood. In the ancient Mesopotamian imagination, the flood was not only a devastating act of divine judgment, but also a pivotal event that reset the world, recalibrated the relationship between gods and humans, and marked a turning point in mythological time. The Mesopotamian flood myth, preserved in various forms and across multiple centuries, is the earliest known version of this archetypal narrative. Long before the Hebrew Bible introduced the story of Noah, and before Greek myths spoke of Deucalion, the Mesopotamians had already composed rich and detailed accounts of a flood sent by the gods to destroy human civilization. These stories appear in both Sumerian and Acadian traditions, most notably in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, and the Sumerian flood story associated with the king Ziusudra. While each version has its own emphases, they share a core structure: divine displeasure, the decision to send a flood, a chosen survivor, a boat, and a renewal of life after the waters recede. The Sumerian version is the oldest known telling of the flood story, likely composed during the 3rd millennium BCE. In this account, the gods decide to destroy humanity, though the text does not dwell at length on the reasons. The hero, Ziusudra, receives a warning from the god Enki, who instructs him to build a large boat. Ziusudra survives the flood, offers a sacrifice, and is granted eternal life. This story, though brief and fragmentary, already contains the central features that will be elaborated in later versions. The Acadian Atrahasis epic, dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, provides a much fuller narrative. Here, the gods are portrayed as overburdened by the noise and labor of humankind. Originally, the lesser gods, the Igigi, were tasked with digging canals and maintaining the land, but they rebelled, forcing the greater gods to create humans to do the work. Over time, as human population grows, so does their noise, described as so loud that the chief god Enlil cannot sleep. Enlil grows increasingly frustrated and sends a series of disasters to reduce humanity: plague, drought, and famine. Each time, the god Enki intervenes, secretly warning the people and helping them survive. Finally, Enlil decides to send a flood to wipe out humanity entirely. This time, Enki is bound by an oath not to interfere. However, using a clever loophole, he speaks to the walls of a reed hut, within which the man Atrahasis is hiding, thus technically not violating the divine decree. He tells Atrahasis to build a large boat, seal it with pitch, and bring his family and animals aboard. When the flood comes, it is catastrophic. The gods themselves are terrified by the force of the destruction. Some weep, Others retreat to the heavens. The imagery is striking. Even the gods lose control of what they have unleashed. After the floodwaters recede, Atrahasis offers a sacrifice. The gods, hungry and repentant, gather around the offering like flies. Enlil, though initially enraged that someone has survived, is calmed by the other gods. A new arrangement is made to prevent humanity from growing too numerous again. This includes instituting infant mortality, celibacy among certain priestesses, and the natural limits of aging. This final scene in the Atrahasis epic reveals a deep Mesopotamian concern with balance. The gods do not desire to destroy humans out of pure malice, but because unchecked growth threatens cosmic equilibrium. The flood is a necessary, if tragic, correction. The resolution is not the elimination of humankind, but the establishment of new boundaries. It is an ancient theological expression of population control, environmental strain, and divine management. The most famous version of the flood myth appears in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero Gilgamesh, searching for the secret of immortality, meets the immortal man Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim recounts how the gods decided to destroy humankind and how he survived by building a large vessel. As in the Atrahasis epic, Enki, here called Ea, provides the warning in an indirect way, speaking through a dream or to a wall. Utnapishtim's boat is described in great detail. It has 7 levels, is sealed with bitumen, and carries all kinds of life. The storm lasts for 6 days and 6 nights. On the 7th day, the waters still. Utnapishtim releases birds to find dry land, first a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven. When the raven fails to return, he knows the land is dry. After disembarking, Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice, and the gods gather around. The goddess Ishtar mourns the destruction and promises that such a flood will never be repeated. Enlil is again angry at the survival of a human, but Ea defends his actions, suggesting that wisdom and restraint should guide divine decisions. As a result, Utnapishtim and his wife are granted eternal life and placed in a remote land. This version of the flood story brings together earlier motifs and adds a philosophical layer. Gilgamesh learns that immortality is not a reward for heroism, but a rare and unrepeatable exception. The gods are shown not as omniscient, but as flawed, divided, and capable of regret. The flood in this narrative becomes a lens through which the epic reflects on loss, survival, and the limits of human striving. What is most striking across all versions of the flood myth is the portrayal of the gods. They are not remote moral arbiters. They are emotionally reactive, often divided in their intentions, and deeply affected by the events they initiate. The flood is not merely an act of punishment. It is a mistake, a crisis, a lesson. The myths suggest that even divine beings struggle with the consequences of their power. The flood myth also highlights the role of the intermediary god, especially Enki, Ea. Without his intervention, humanity would be extinguished. His actions are not framed as rebellion, but as acts of wisdom and foresight. He embodies the principle that divine law must be tempered with compassion and strategy. Culturally, the flood narrative served multiple purposes. It explained the presence of great floods in Mesopotamian history, particularly those that affected the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. It provided a mythic origin for certain kings and priesthoods, those who claimed descent from flood survivors. It reinforced the central Mesopotamian idea that human life is fragile, subject to divine will, and maintained only through ritual, humility, and divine favor. The story also served as a cosmic reset, a mythic justification for the reorganization of society. After the flood, new orders were established, new limits enforced, and new relationships between gods and humans defined. In this sense, the flood is not simply destruction, it is transformation. Finally, the flood myth's legacy is global. Elements of it appear in the Hebrew Bible, where Noah plays the role of the righteous survivor. While the theological messages differ, the structure is similar. Divine judgment, a chosen individual, a boat, animals, a deluge, and a promise never to repeat the act. This transmission of narrative themes from Mesopotamia to other ancient cultures underscores the enduring power of these early myths. In Mesopotamian thought, the flood was both a warning and a renewal. It showed that divine patience had limits, but also that compassion could emerge even after catastrophe. Through Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim, the myth teaches that survival requires wisdom, obedience, and a sense of proportion, not only among mortals, but also among the gods themselves. In Mesopotamian mythology, the realm of the dead was not a place of torment or reward, but a grim, shadowy land where all souls eventually journeyed, regardless of their earthly deeds. This afterlife, often referred to as the Kur, or the land of no return, was a silent, dusty domain ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, the elder sister of Inanna. It was a world without light, joy, or memory, a distant mirror of life above, stripped of vitality and hope. Unlike later religious systems that imagined judgment or salvation after death, the Mesopotamian view of the underworld was markedly neutral and somber. Death was an absolute transition. Once a person crossed the threshold into the underworld, they became a Gidam, a spirit that retained its name and personality, but lost its agency and physical form. These spirits continued a muted existence, feeding on dust and clay, unless properly cared for by the living through ritual and offerings. The entrance to the underworld was imagined as lying beneath the earth, sometimes reached through a mountain or desert passage. To enter, the dead had to cross a river and pass through a series of gates guarded by demons and gatekeepers. Each gate required the surrender of an item or a symbolic act of submission, echoing the themes of transition and transformation present in earlier myths such as Inanna's descent. The goddess Ereshkigal, who ruled this realm, is one of the most enigmatic and commanding figures in Mesopotamian myth. Unlike her sister Inanna, Ereshkigal does not appear frequently in hymns or epics, but when she does, her presence is formidable. She is described as majestic, implacable, and fiercely bound to her role. Her realm is not hellish in the moral sense, but it is absolute. Even gods who enter do so at their own peril. In the myth of Inanna's descent, which has already been partially explored in an earlier section, Ereshkigal receives her sister not with welcome, but with death. When Inanna enters the underworld uninvited, Ereshkigal orders her killed and hung on a hook. This act is not petty vengeance, but a defense of cosmic balance. In the Mesopotamian cosmos, boundaries between realms were inviolable. Life could not trespass into death without consequence. Ereshkigal's authority was total within her domain, and she enforced it with finality. However, Ereshkigal is not portrayed as a villain. In the same myth, when Inanna's body is recovered through the intervention of Enki's emissaries, Ereshkigal displays grief and pain, even granting the resurrection reluctantly but fairly. In some versions, she is shown weeping, her cries described as those of a woman in childbirth, suggesting that even in death there are echoes of creation and transformation. Her emotional range adds depth to her character, revealing her as a complex divine figure shaped by solitude and inevitability. Another important figure associated with the underworld is Nergal, a god of plague and war, who, in later myths, becomes Ereshkigal's consort and co-ruler. The myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal tells how Nergal initially insults her by refusing to bow before her messenger. As punishment, he is summoned to the underworld. Armed and defiant, he storms her realm and threatens to overthrow her. However, rather than fighting, the myth takes a surprising turn. Ereshkigal proposes marriage. Nergal accepts, and the two become joint rulers of the underworld. This myth has multiple layers. On one level, it is a tale of conflict turned into union, a reflection of power dynamics between male and female deities. On another, it shows the integration of older underworld beliefs into newer cultic frameworks. Nergal, previously a god associated with disease and destruction, becomes institutionalized as a divine judge, balancing Ereshkigal's authority with a masculine counterpart. Ruling together, Ereshkigal and Nergal presided over the destiny of the dead. Their temple was imagined not in a physical location, but as a vast subterranean palace. The spirits of the dead gathered there, stripped of status and memory. Unlike Egyptian or Greek traditions, Mesopotamian afterlife did not include elaborate visions of punishment or reward. Even kings and priests became shadows in the underworld. The only relief came through offerings made by living relatives, food, drink, and incense given at gravesites or temples, meant to sustain the spirit. This practice of ancestral offerings reveals much about Mesopotamian values. The dead depended on the living for sustenance and remembrance. A person who died without family or whose descendants neglected rituals was thought to suffer a particularly bleak fate, wandering hungry, forgotten, and restless. Therefore, family piety was not only a moral duty, but a spiritual necessity. The underworld was also a setting for dreams, visions, and omens. Mesopotamian diviners and priests believed that certain types of dreams were messages from the dead who could offer warnings, predictions, or requests. These communications were part of a complex system of divination and necromancy, overseen by temple specialists who interpreted signs through ritual and astrology. Spirits, though powerless in the underworld, could still affect the world above through subtle influences. One such example appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Enkidu, after his death, visits the underworld in a dream and describes its bleakness. He tells Gilgamesh that the dead eat clay, dwell in darkness, and are assigned tasks or roles according to their past lives. Though the epic does not elaborate a moral structure, it reinforces the concept of the underworld as a dull continuation of existence, a place stripped of the joys and vibrancy of earthly life. Mesopotamian myths rarely offer comfort about death. Instead, they encourage a focus on the present, to build cities, form relationships, perform rituals, and seek wisdom. Immortality, if attainable at all, comes not through the afterlife, but through legacy, reputation, and the continuity of civilization. The dead may fade, but their names can endure through inscriptions, monuments, and memory. Interestingly, despite the gloomy nature of the underworld, it was also respected. Deities associated with it were honored, not shunned. Rituals to appease underworld gods and spirits were part of regular religious practice. Temples maintained laments and offerings to ensure that divine balance was preserved. Death was not an aberration. It was a natural phase of cosmic order, ruled by gods as necessary and powerful as those of the heavens and earth. In rare instances, individuals were believed to have descended into the underworld and returned, most notably Inanna. These stories were not about overcoming death in a literal sense, but about transformation through confronting loss, mystery, and boundaries. To descend into the underworld, whether in myth or in ritual imagination, was to gain insight into the limitations and responsibilities of life. This understanding of death also shaped Mesopotamian law and ethics. Justice was viewed not only in terms of divine retribution, but as part of maintaining order between the living and the dead. The Code of Hammurabi, for example, emphasizes proper burial and inheritance, ensuring that ancestral lines and duties are preserved. The dead were not feared in a ghostly sense, but respected as part of a broader cosmic system. Over time, as political centers shifted and new empires rose, beliefs about the underworld evolved. Later Babylonian and Assyrian texts include more elaborate demonologies, with named spirits, judges, and procedural descriptions of death. Yet the core vision remained intact: the underworld as a domain of silence, ruled by Ereshkigal, beyond the reach of mortal achievement, but still connected to the world through memory, ritual, and myth. In the Mesopotamian worldview, death was neither a doorway to paradise nor a punishment for sin. It was a return to the earth, a descent into the dust, a leveling of kings and servants alike. But through proper remembrance, through offerings and laments, the living could maintain a thread of connection. The gods of the underworld did not demand adoration. They demanded respect and acknowledgement. For the people of ancient Mesopotamia, the gods were not distant beings confined to myth and temple ritual. They were deeply entwined with the natural world, social events, and personal decisions. The divine communicated not only through formal rituals or epic deeds, but also through signs, omens, dreams, and symbols woven into everyday life. In this context, magic and divination were not fringe practices. They were institutionalized systems of knowledge grounded in religious belief and supported by highly trained professionals. Understanding the divine required interpretation. Whether it was a lunar eclipse, the flight of birds, or an unusual birth, every unusual event could carry a message from the gods. Mesopotamian priests, particularly in major temple complexes such as those in Nippur, Ur, Babylon, and Nineveh, developed detailed methods to read these messages. The practitioners of this sacred craft were known as Baru priests, exorcists, healers, and scribes, each fulfilling specific roles in the larger system of spiritual and intellectual inquiry. One of the most respected divine figures associated with wisdom, scribal authority, and interpretation was the god Nabu. Son of Marduk, Nabu emerged as a powerful deity during the first millennium BCE, particularly in Babylonian and Assyrian traditions. He was the god of writing, wisdom, and divine decree, and his temple at Borsippa, known as the Ezida, became a major intellectual and religious center. Nabu's role extended beyond writing itself. He was believed to be the one who recorded the fates of both humans and gods, inscribing the destinies that governed life on earth and in the heavens. His association with the stylus, a wedge-shaped instrument used in cuneiform writing, symbolized his power to define outcomes through knowledge. In state rituals, Nabu was invoked as the scribe who kept order in the universe, and in annual ceremonies such as the Akitu festival, he was praised for his role in finalizing the decrees issued by the high gods. Mesopotamian scribes were not merely copyists, they were scholars and diviners, trained in complex systems of omen interpretation. This training began early and continued for years, often within temple academies. Scribes mastered multiple languages and scripts, memorized long texts, and practiced the art of logic and deduction. Many of their efforts were recorded in massive compendia, carefully organized collections of observations, outcomes, and interpretations. One of the most famous of these is the Enuma Anu Enlil, a vast compilation of omens based on celestial phenomena. This work, likely assembled over many centuries, includes hundreds of tablets and thousands of entries, each noting how a particular astronomical event, such as a lunar eclipse, comet, or planetary conjunction, might influence the fate of the king, the land, or the people. These omens were not speculative guesses. They were grounded in meticulous empirical observation and supported by long-term records. In this way, Mesopotamian astrology was both a science and a religious practice. In addition to celestial omens, the Mesopotamians paid close attention to terrestrial signs, including animal behavior, weather patterns, plant anomalies, and birth defects. A particularly well-known example is the Shuma Izbu series, which focused on unusual births in humans and animals. For instance, the birth of a two-headed lamb or a child with an abnormal limb could signal divine warning or blessing, depending on context. Diviners interpreted these signs using a system of correspondences and analogies. A cracked liver of a sacrificial animal might reflect the instability of a city wall. The movement of smoke in a ritual fire could predict military success or failure. The belief was that the gods, especially Enlil, Shamash, and Nabu, communicated indirectly through the fabric of the world, and that humans could access divine intent by learning to read those patterns. In contrast to these interpretive methods, apotropaic magic focused on protection, healing, and purification. It was practiced by Ashipu priests, also known as exorcists. These specialists conducted rituals to ward off evil, cure illnesses, and remove curses. They often worked with amulets, incantations, and symbolic objects, such as clay figurines of demons, herbs, water, and fire, to create boundaries between the afflicted person and malevolent forces. One prominent example of this protective tradition is the invocation of Pazuzu. a fearsome demon figure with the head of a lion or dog, wings, and a scorpion's tail. Although Pazuzu was considered a demon, he was invoked to protect against even worse entities such as Lamashtu, a female demon associated with miscarriages and infant death. Amulets bearing Pazuzu's image were buried under thresholds or worn by pregnant women to ensure protection. Healing rituals often involved a blend of prayer, incantation, medicine, and spiritual diagnosis. A patient might receive both a poultice and a protective charm, along with a recitation designed to expel the source of harm. Illness, in Mesopotamian belief, was not simply physical. It was often caused by divine displeasure, spiritual attack, or broken taboos. Therefore, a proper cure required rebalancing the cosmic and bodily order through words, offerings, and action. Dreams also played a critical role in Mesopotamian spiritual life. Dreams were believed to be a direct channel to the divine or the dead, and many texts survive detailing how to interpret them. Dream omens were classified based on their content, symbolism, and emotional tone. A person who dreamed of flying might expect an elevation in social status. Dreaming of eating certain foods could signify illness or betrayal. Professional dream interpreters used standardized guides, but also relied on personal intuition and experience. The production and preservation of these systems of knowledge depended heavily on the temple libraries, especially during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods. The most famous of these was the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, compiled in the 7th century BCE. This vast collection included thousands of clay tablets covering literature, history, science, medicine, and magic. Many of the tablets recovered from this library are our primary sources for Mesopotamian myths, rituals, and scholarly practices today. Ashurbanipal himself claimed to be a learned king, trained in reading, writing, and interpreting omens. His inscriptions describe how he could read the cunning tablets of Sumer and the dark Acadian language, boasting of his ability to understand divine messages. This portrayal reflects the close association between royal power and divine insight, a theme consistent throughout Mesopotamian history. Kings ruled not only through strength and law, but through alignment with the cosmic order, deciphered and enforced by scribes and priests. The practice of divination and magic was not isolated to temples or courts. Everyday people also sought answers from the gods through personal rituals, household shrines, and consultation with local wise men or women. Clay figurines, protective spells, and simple prayers were part of domestic life. In this way, sacred knowledge was both centralized and diffused, embedded in the daily rhythm of Mesopotamian society. Importantly, magic and divination were not seen as irrational or marginal. They were deeply rational within the Mesopotamian worldview, rooted in consistent methods, careful documentation, and theological justification. To seek a sign from the gods or to perform a protective spell was to participate in the divine structure of reality, not to manipulate it, but to understand and harmonize with it. Even skeptics or critics of these practices are absent in the written record. This suggests not a lack of debate, but a deep consensus on the reality and utility of these systems. They were tools of survival, governance, health, and spiritual clarity. In conclusion, Mesopotamian divination and magical practice represented a highly developed system of communication between mortals and gods. Through the guidance of scribes, priests, and interpreters, the people of Mesopotamia sought meaning in a world full of uncertainty. They read the stars and sacrificed animals, purified the sick and blessed the newborn, invoked demons to ward off worse demons, and turned to their gods not only in ritual, but in every crack of lightning, every twist of fate, every dream remembered at dawn. As Mesopotamian civilization progressed beyond its Sumerian roots, its mythological and religious traditions evolved alongside changing political landscapes. One of the most significant turning points came during the rise of the Acadian Empire, a powerful, multilingual state that unified much of Mesopotamia under centralized rule for the first time. At the heart of this transformation was Sargon of Akkad, a ruler whose ascent not only reshaped politics, but also catalyzed a profound synthesis of mythology, religion, and imperial ideology. The Acadian Empire emerged in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, when Sargon, born in humble circumstances according to later legends, consolidated power in the city of Akkad. He overthrew the ruling king of Kish, conquered major Sumerian city-states including Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, and eventually extended his influence to parts of Syria and Elam. His rule marked the beginning of what could be called Mesopotamia's first empire, an administrative and military system that transcended the older model of rival city-states. This unification presented both opportunity and challenge. While Akkadian became the language of administration and diplomacy, the population still spoke Sumerian in many regions. Likewise, the religious traditions across Mesopotamia were diverse and deeply rooted in local customs. To govern effectively, Sargon and his successors had to do more than dominate militarily. They had to create a coherent imperial culture, and mythology was one of the most powerful tools available. Instead of replacing older myths, the Acadians absorbed and reinterpreted them. Gods who had once belonged to specific cities were now given broader, empire-wide identities. This process of religious integration allowed different regions to maintain local pride while acknowledging the supremacy of the central authority. For example, Ishtar, originally a Sumerian goddess known as Inanna, became a principal deity of the Acadian pantheon. Her martial and royal attributes made her particularly suitable for imperial propaganda. Under Sargon and his descendants, Ishtar was frequently invoked as a protector of kingship and military conquest. In inscriptions and temple dedications, she was praised for granting victory, destroying enemies, and guiding the ruler in battle. By aligning himself with Ishtar, Sargon connected his reign to divine favor, not merely through ritual, but as part of a larger mythological narrative of destiny, power, and legitimacy. The use of myth for political purposes became even more pronounced during the reign of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson. Naram-Sin pushed imperial ideology to new heights by proclaiming himself King of the Four Quarters, a title suggesting dominion over the entire known world. In a significant departure from tradition, he also declared himself a living god, a claim previously reserved for divine heroes or legendary figures. This deification was reinforced through visual and textual means. One of the most famous artifacts from this period is the victory stele of Naram-Sin, which depicts the king ascending a mountain, wearing a horned helmet, a symbol of divinity. Unlike earlier royal depictions that showed kings in the presence of gods, Naram-Sin appears alone, above his soldiers and enemies, receiving divine radiance directly. The implication is clear. He is both a warrior and a god, the embodiment of divine order on earth. Naram-Sin's claim to divinity sparked debate among later Mesopotamian scribes and historians. Some later texts portray his reign as the beginning of hubris and divine punishment. A notable example is the so-called Curse of Akkad, a literary composition written centuries after the fall of the Acadian Empire. In this text, the gods punish the Acadian rulers for their pride and impiety, particularly for desecrating the temple of Enlil in Nippur. The myth frames the collapse of the empire as a moral and religious failure, a warning about the consequences of overreaching power. Despite such retrospective critiques, the Acadian period marked a lasting transformation in how mythology functioned within statecraft. The idea that a ruler could be the earthly reflection or even incarnation of divine will gained traction. Myth became a language of sovereignty, diplomacy, and imperial integration. This period also saw a flourishing of literary and scholarly activity, much of it focused on preserving and adapting Sumerian myths into Akkadian form. Stories such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, originally composed in Sumerian, were expanded and standardized in Acadian. Deities like Enki, Ea, and Enlil retained their importance, but their roles were recast to suit new theological frameworks. For example, Ea became increasingly associated with wisdom and cosmic order, while Marduk, though not yet at the height of his later prominence, began to rise in status. Importantly, the Acadian synthesis did not erase local cults. Instead, It created a layered religious system in which local gods were integrated into a larger divine bureaucracy. This approach allowed imperial administration to function without undermining traditional authority. In cities like Sippar, Mari, and Ashur, temples continued to operate, often with royal support. In many cases, rulers donated resources to multiple deities across the empire, reinforcing their image as universal benefactors and protectors of sacred order. The fusion of political ambition with religious tradition also extended to legal and administrative texts. Kings issued decrees claiming divine mandate, often referencing the will of the gods as justification for taxation, conscription, and justice. Royal inscriptions routinely framed victories as acts of divine will, while defeats were blamed on ritual failures or temporary withdrawal of divine favor. What emerges from this period is a more sophisticated and instrumental use of mythology. The gods were not merely worshipped, they were mobilized. Their myths were edited, curated, and reshaped to serve imperial goals. Sacred narratives were used to promote unity, suppress dissent, and reinforce hierarchy. At the same time, the spiritual dimension was not lost. Rituals, festivals, and offerings continued with vigor, and devotion remained central to both public and private life. The Acadian synthesis also had lasting effects on the evolution of Mesopotamian religion. Many of the structures and strategies developed during this time, such as linking kingship with divine favor, adapting local myths into a shared cultural framework, and promoting royal ideology through sacred art, would be replicated by later empires, including the Babylonians and Assyrians. Even after the Acadian Empire eventually fragmented due to internal strain and external pressure, its mythological legacy endured. The concept of the god-supported king, the imperial use of myth, and the cosmopolitan blending of local and national religious traditions would become foundational to Mesopotamian civilization. In summary, the Acadian period represents a turning point in the political use of mythology. Sargon's conquests were not only military victories, they were narrative victories. By embedding his reign in sacred history, invoking powerful deities like Ishtar, and commissioning works that portrayed kings as divine agents, he and his descendants created an empire not only of land, but of meaning. Myth became state policy, and through this fusion, the gods of Mesopotamia became more than distant figures. They became partners in empire. With the decline of the Acadian Empire and the fragmentation of its imperial authority, new powers began to emerge across Mesopotamia. Among these, one city would rise to dominate the religious, cultural, and political landscape for centuries to come: Babylon. Its ascent was not only a story of military or economic power, it was also a story of mythological innovation. Central to this transformation was the elevation of the god Marduk, who would become the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, supplanting older gods like Enlil as the symbolic center of cosmic and political order. Marduk's rise to supremacy was gradual and closely tied to the fortunes of Babylon itself. Originally a local deity, Marduk's early characteristics included associations with water, vegetation, judgment, and magic. He inherited some of the attributes of Enki, known as Ea in Acadian, his father in later mythology. As Babylon's influence grew during the early 2nd millennium BCE, especially under the rule of Hammurabi, so too did Marduk's prominence. The most comprehensive and influential expression of Marduk's new status appears in the Enuma Elish, also known as the Babylonian creation epic. This monumental text, composed sometime during the late 2nd millennium BCE, was likely crafted during or shortly after the reign of Hammurabi and was recited during the Akatu festival, Babylon's New Year celebration. The Enuma Elish did not merely recount the origins of the universe. It reordered the theological structure of the entire Mesopotamian cosmos, placing Marduk at its center. The epic begins in the primordial past, where Apsu, freshwater, and Tiamat, saltwater, existed in a chaotic state of undifferentiated potential. From their mingling, younger gods were born, who became increasingly disruptive and difficult to control. Apsu, disturbed by their noise, resolves to destroy them. But the god Ea, one of the younger deities, acts preemptively, killing Apsu and establishing his dwelling upon the defeated primordial waters. Tiamat, furious at the murder of her consort, gathers an army of monstrous beings and appoints Kingu, her new consort, as their leader. She also grants Kingu the Tablet of Destinies, a divine object that bestows supreme authority. The gods, in disarray and fear, turn to Marduk, who promises to defeat Tiamat, but only on one condition: that he be made king of the gods should he succeed. The gods agree, and Marduk prepares for battle. Armed with divine weapons, winds, and magic, he confronts Tiamat in a cosmic clash. He captures her in a net, pierces her with an arrow, and splits her body in two. From one half, he creates the heavens, from the other, the earth. He then organizes time, assigns duties to the celestial bodies, and constructs the Ashara, the heavenly temple of the gods. With the cosmos in place, Marduk slays Kingu and uses his blood to create human beings, assigning them the task of serving the gods so that the deities may rest. This myth achieves several theological and political goals at once. First, it places Marduk above all other gods, portraying him not only as a warrior and creator, but as the architect of order itself. Second, it redefines the origin of humanity, reinforcing the long-held Mesopotamian belief that humans were created for labor and divine service, but attributing this decision specifically to Marduk. Third, it positions Babylon as the axis of the universe, the city chosen by Marduk as his dwelling and the center from which order radiates. In this narrative, older deities such as Anu, Enlil, and Ea do not disappear, but they are subordinated. Marduk is granted 50 names, many of which were previously epithets of other gods, including Enlil. This act is not a simple renaming. It is a deliberate theological consolidation. Marduk becomes a composite god, embodying the powers, functions, and symbols of the broader Mesopotamian pantheon. Through this synthesis, the Enuma Elish offers not just a story, but a religious and ideological charter for Babylon's dominance. The political implications of Marduk's supremacy were profound. Kings of Babylon claimed legitimacy through their relationship with Marduk. Even when Babylon was not militarily dominant, its religious prestige often remained intact. During the Akitu festival, the king would participate in rituals that symbolically reenacted the creation myth. One of the most striking elements of the festival involved the king being stripped of his regalia, struck by the high priest, and then reaffirmed in his role, an act meant to humble the ruler before Marduk and renew his divine mandate. Temples dedicated to Marduk, particularly the Esagila in Babylon, became major centers of worship, administration, and learning. The ziggurat associated with the temple, known as the Etemenanki, was possibly the structure later described as the Tower of Babel. These sacred buildings were not only places of ritual, but also political symbols, embodying the unity between divine cosmos and human governance. The elevation of Marduk also influenced the transmission and adaptation of earlier myths. Many older Sumerian stories were revised in Acadian and Babylonian versions, to include Marduk more prominently or to align with the new theological hierarchy. This process of reinterpretation was part of a broader cultural project, to present Babylon not merely as a successor to Sumer and Akkad, but as the culmination of Mesopotamian civilization. Marduk's rise did not go unchallenged. As new powers emerged in the region, particularly the Assyrians, they sought to assert their own religious supremacy. In Assyria, the god Ashur was elevated in a manner similar to Marduk. In fact, later Assyrian scribes adapted the Enuma Elish, replacing Marduk's name with Ashur's, thereby rebranding the story to suit their imperial narrative. This act illustrates how mythology remained flexible, serving as a tool for religious legitimacy and political assertion across centuries. Nevertheless, Marduk's place in Babylonian theology remained dominant well into the first millennium BCE. His name continued to be invoked in royal inscriptions, treaties, and prayers. The mythological framework established by the Enuma Elish became the foundation of Babylonian religious identity, influencing everything from legal codes to cosmological diagrams. Marduk's characteristics also evolved over time. While initially depicted as a warrior and storm god, later texts emphasized his wisdom, justice, and mercy. He was invoked in prayers for healing, guidance, and protection. His association with Nabu, the god of wisdom and writing, further enhanced his image as a rational and benevolent ruler, reflecting the maturing vision of divine kingship in Babylonian thought. Through Marduk, Babylon achieved what no city-state had before: the unification of myth, religion, and politics into a coherent, empire-wide ideology. The gods had always served as symbols of power, but Marduk became the symbol of power itself, a god who did not simply govern one domain, but who reorganized the cosmos, elevated humanity, and crowned kings. In conclusion, the rise of Marduk marks a decisive moment in Mesopotamian mythology. His ascent reflects both theological innovation and political strategy, transforming a local city god into the king of the gods. Through epic narrative, ritual practice, and imperial ideology, Marduk became the embodiment of Babylon's vision of order, justice, and divine rule. His story is not just about the triumph of one god over others, but about the power of myth to define civilization. As the Babylonian world gave theological primacy to Marduk and framed kingship within a structure of divine order and mercy, a different narrative was taking shape farther to the north. In the heartlands of Assyria, the Mesopotamian pantheon and mythological worldview underwent a notable transformation, one centered not on creation and cosmic balance, but on power, conquest, and the sacred authority of kingship. In this chapter of Mesopotamian mythological history, the god Ashur took center stage, and Assyrian rulers recast themselves as living agents of divine will, warriors who enforced cosmic order through imperial dominance. The Assyrian Empire, which rose to prominence during the 2nd millennium BCE and reached its zenith in the 1st millennium BCE, drew heavily from the earlier traditions of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. Yet it also reconfigured those traditions to fit the militaristic and expansionist ideology that defined Assyrian statecraft. Assyrian kings did not merely claim divine support, they presented themselves as extensions of the god Ashur's power on earth, leading military campaigns not for personal gain, but as sacred duties ordained by heaven. At the heart of this ideology was Ashur, the national god of the Assyrians. Originally a city god associated with the city of Ashur, he was later elevated to the supreme position in the Assyrian pantheon. Unlike Marduk, whose rise was framed through theological synthesis and cosmological creation, Ashur's elevation was more political and symbolic. He was envisioned not as a creator god in the traditional sense, but as the embodiment of sovereignty, conquest, and divine kingship. In many ways, Ashur assumed the role once held by Enlil, becoming the ultimate arbiter of kingship and divine fate. However, Ashur was more closely and intimately tied to the Assyrian king. The king was not merely chosen by Ashur, he was Ashur's representative, his arm, his commander on earth. This relationship allowed Assyrian rulers to justify aggressive expansion, framing their military campaigns as holy wars designed to enforce divine order across the known world. One of the most striking expressions of this mythological political fusion can be seen in the royal inscriptions of Assyrian kings, particularly those of Ashurnasirpal II, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal. These inscriptions describe military victories not simply as historical events, but as fulfillments of divine destiny. Cities are conquered, peoples are deported, temples are rebuilt, not because of human ambition, but because Ashur commanded it. In these texts, the king is frequently described using titles such as King of the Universe, Shepherd of the People, and the Favorite of Ashur. Assyrian annals often begin with invocations to the gods, especially Ashur and Ishtar, emphasizing that every action of the king was guided by divine mandate. These inscriptions were carved into palace walls, commemorative stelae, and foundation cylinders, meant not only to record events but to teach, warn, and inspire loyalty. Ishtar, or Ishtar of Nineveh, also played a prominent role in the Assyrian adaptation of Mesopotamian myth. While earlier traditions highlighted her dual nature as a goddess of love and war, in Assyria, her warlike attributes were emphasized above all. She became a protector of the Assyrian army and a patroness of royal power. Kings frequently attributed their military success to her favor, portraying her as riding into battle, breaking enemy lines, and choosing victors. This emphasis on divine warfare found further expression in art. Assyrian palace reliefs depict scenes of military conquest, siege warfare, and ritual hunting with stunning detail and precision. In these images, the king stands at the center of the world, slaying lions, trampling enemies, and offering the spoils of war to Ashur and the gods. These visual narratives are not mere propaganda. They are iconographic expressions of myth, turning the king into a living mythological figure. Perhaps the most ambitious expression of this ideology appears in the reign of Sennacherib, who moved the imperial capital from Kalhu, Nimrud, to Nineveh, and undertook massive building projects, including the construction of grand palaces and gardens. Sennacherib described his works as inspired by the gods and even likened his achievements to cosmic renewal. However, his reign also illustrates the dangers of unchecked divine kingship. His destruction of Babylon in retribution for rebellion was unprecedented and deeply controversial, prompting later rulers to rebuild the city and reframe its destruction as a divine misjudgment. This tension between sacred kingship and hubris runs throughout Assyrian mythology and royal literature. The figure of the king was glorified, but also constrained by divine expectation. Failing to act in accordance with Ashur's will could bring disaster. The king was both agent and servant, powerful but accountable to the very gods whose power he wielded. A more nuanced vision of Assyrian mythological thinking can be seen during the reign of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. A scholar king as well as a warrior, Ashurbanipal assembled the famous library of Nineveh, collecting thousands of clay tablets from across Mesopotamia. Many of the myths and texts that survive today, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, and numerous hymns, medical texts, and incantations, were preserved because of his efforts. Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions combine religious devotion with royal confidence. In one text, he claims that Ashur and Ishtar entrusted the kingship of the four quarters to me, emphasizing his universal dominion under divine sanction. Yet his texts also reveal an awareness of human limitation. He speaks of consulting omens, seeking the gods' guidance, and punishing those who violate sacred order. In religious practice, Assyrian temples remained active centers of worship, ritual, and divination. The city of Ashur retained its sacred status, and temples dedicated to Ishtar, Nabu, and other deities were constructed or restored throughout the empire. Priests, exorcists, and diviners continued to perform rituals, interpret omens, and advise the court. These practices ensured that mythological belief remained embedded in the administrative and spiritual life of the empire. Even foreign gods were incorporated into Assyrian religious life. Conquered peoples were often allowed to maintain their cults, and in some cases, Assyrian kings restored or built temples for foreign deities, as long as they acknowledged Ashur's supremacy. This policy of controlled religious inclusion helped stabilize the empire and gave Assyrian rule a veneer of universality. But the mythology of conquest carried within it a fatal weakness. As the empire expanded beyond its ability to sustain itself, and as internal strife and rebellion grew, the ideology of divinely sanctioned warfare began to falter. When the empire collapsed in the late 7th century BCE, its fall was not seen as merely political. It was interpreted as a withdrawal of divine favor. Just as myth had supported the rise of Assyria, it now explained its downfall. Later, Babylonian and Persian rulers would inherit and reinterpret many elements of Assyrian theology, yet the image of Ashur as the militant god-king and the Assyrian king as his earthly commander remained unique in Mesopotamian tradition. It reflected a society that saw power as sacred, conquest as duty, and myth as the engine of empire. In summary, the Assyrian adaptation of Mesopotamian mythology forged a new and potent expression of divine kingship. Through Ashur and Ishtar, through military conquest and monumental art, the Assyrians transformed myth into imperial theology. They made the king a figure of mythic proportions and gave their wars the weight of divine necessity. In doing so, they reshaped the gods themselves, giving them new roles, new cities, and a new place in the ever-evolving narrative of Mesopotamian civilization. While kings raised ziggurats to Marduk and marched under the banners of Ashur and Ishtar, the daily religious lives of ordinary Mesopotamians were shaped by a different group of divine beings, lesser-known gods, demons, household spirits, and personal protectors. These figures did not occupy the heights of the pantheon, nor did they command empires, but they were far more immediate, intimate, and tangible to the people who prayed, feared, and lived among them. In the villages, markets, and homes of Mesopotamia, religion was not confined to monumental temples or state-sponsored rituals. It existed in domestic altars, charms, amulets, dreams, and whispered incantations. While the great gods represented cosmic and political order, the minor deities and spirits governed the microcosms of daily life: health, childbirth, dreams, weather, illness, and protection from misfortune. These minor divine beings were not lesser in significance, only in scale. In fact, for most people, they were the first line of spiritual interaction, the ones who could be approached without royal mediation or temple protocol. They populated a vast and dynamic spiritual landscape that extended beyond human sight but was constantly felt in the rhythms of life and death. Among the most recognized of these spirits was Pazuzu, a fearsome-looking figure with a combination of animal and human features. He had a lion or dog-like face, bulging eyes, sharp fangs, wings, and a scorpion's tail. Despite his terrifying appearance, Pazuzu was invoked for protection, particularly against Lamashtu, a demoness who threatened pregnant women and infants. Pazuzu was believed to counter evil with evil, a dangerous force harnessed for a righteous cause. Amulets bearing his image were worn by women during pregnancy and childbirth, buried beneath doorways, or placed at the entrances of homes to ward off harm. Lamashtu, in contrast, was truly malevolent. Often depicted with bird talons and holding snakes, she was said to kidnap newborns, poison mother's milk, and bring illness. Her mythological role reflected the high infant mortality rates and dangers associated with childbirth in the ancient world. Rituals designed to drive her away often involved effigies, chants, and offerings, sometimes calling on Pazuzu as her divine opponent. Beyond these fearsome beings, the Mesopotamian spirit world included hundreds of named and unnamed entities, many of which fell into categories such as Utuku, ghosts, Galu, underworld demons, and Shedu, protective spirits. Ghosts in particular were thought to linger when not properly buried or remembered. A restless spirit could cause madness, disease, or nightmares. Therefore, honoring the dead through family rituals and grave offerings was essential, not just as a social custom, but as a spiritual obligation. The concept of personal gods also played a central role in Mesopotamian religious life. These were deities, often unnamed, believed to be assigned to each individual at birth. A person's god and goddess acted as guardians, mediators, and spiritual guides. When someone experienced hardship, it was sometimes said that their personal god had turned away. In such cases, prayers, offerings, or rituals were performed to restore the bond and seek divine favor again. Texts from various periods include personal prayers, lamentations, and confessions, many of which show deep emotional appeal to these personal deities. One tablet reads, "My God, I do not know what sin I have committed. My goddess, I do not know what fault I have done. Though I am fed, I am hungry. Though I am clothed, I am naked. How long, O my God, will you be angry? Will your heart not relent?" This expression of spiritual distress, humility, and hope reveals a deeply personal relationship between the believer and the divine, even when the divine remains silent. It is in these texts that we see the psychological dimension of Mesopotamian religion, not just grand rituals and state theology, but individual longing, anxiety, and the need for meaning in the face of suffering. Households often maintained small domestic altars where offerings of incense, food, or drink might be placed. Clay figurines of deities or protective spirits were common. Small shrines could be dedicated to gods such as Gula, the goddess of healing, or Ningal, the mother goddess. These shrines were not merely decorative, they represented active spiritual relationships. The gods of the home were asked to bless the family, protect the property, and ensure health and fertility. Another essential figure in the spiritual life of ordinary people was the healer-exorcist, known as an Ashipu. These practitioners were trained in diagnosing spiritual ailments, performing protective rituals, and invoking specific gods or spirits. For example, if someone suffered from unexplained fever or delirium, it might be interpreted as a sign of possession by a ghost or an attack by an underworld demon. The Ashipu would recite incantations, burn incense, and use symbolic objects, such as carved figurines or magic circles, to expel the spirit and restore balance. Similarly, the Baru priest or diviner would be consulted to interpret omens and guide decisions. Even everyday events, like a strange animal entering the house, a sudden dream, or a flickering flame, could be perceived as messages from the divine realm. These interpretations helped people navigate uncertainty, especially in matters of health, travel, marriage, and agriculture. In addition to rituals and prayers, many people turned to written charms and protective texts. These were inscribed on clay tablets, cylinder seals, or metal plaques and carried on the body or hung in homes. One common form of protective device was the lamasu, a winged, human-headed bull or lion figure placed at the entrances of palaces and temples. While typically associated with royalty, the lamasu symbolized the broader idea of divine guardianship, a spiritual boundary between order and chaos. Children were especially vulnerable in the Mesopotamian worldview, and many protective measures were aimed at safeguarding them from both physical and spiritual threats. Amulets, lullabies, and symbolic drawings were employed to shield them. Mothers and nurses were trained in rituals to bless and cleanse infants, ensuring their peaceful integration into the living world. Importantly, Mesopotamian religion did not sharply divide the sacred from the mundane. The divine permeated every sphere of life. Planting a field, starting a business, building a house, or naming a child. Each action carried spiritual weight and was often accompanied by ritual acts to ensure success and ward off misfortune. This integration of religion into daily life was sustained over millennia and across multiple empires. Even as the names of kings and high gods changed, from Sumerian to Acadian to Babylonian to Assyrian, the fundamental structure of popular piety and domestic spirituality remained remarkably stable. The people of Mesopotamia continued to live in a world inhabited by unseen beings, where divine favor was uncertain, but always sought through devotion, discipline, and ritual care. In this world, the gods were not always benevolent, and the spirits were not always distant. The line between protection and danger was thin, and the responsibility to maintain spiritual order fell not only to kings and priests, but to every household, every family, and every individual. In conclusion, the minor gods, demons, and household spirits of Mesopotamian belief were not footnotes in mythology. They were its foundation in everyday life. Through them, the people of Mesopotamia found comfort, protection, and a measure of control in a world full of uncertainty. Their presence reminds us that ancient religion was not only about the heavens and the state, but about the quiet prayers offered at night, the small offerings left on clay altars, and the hope that, even in the dust and shadows, the divine was listening. After thousands of years shaping the identity, cosmology, and political order of Mesopotamia, the ancient religion that had once given life to gods like Enlil, Inanna, Marduk, and Ashur entered a long period of decline. The transformation was neither sudden nor uniform. Rather, it unfolded gradually as foreign empires rose, new theological systems took hold, and the intellectual and religious center of gravity began to shift. Still, the echoes of the old myths lingered, woven into rituals borrowed by conquerors and preserved by scribes. The decline of Mesopotamian religion cannot be attributed to a single event. It was shaped by a series of disruptions over several centuries: foreign invasions, shifting political powers, changing demographics, and evolving spiritual beliefs. By the first millennium BCE, especially during the Persian, Hellenistic, and later Parthian periods, the once dominant religious system that had united city and cosmos was being redefined, marginalized, or replaced. One of the most critical transitions came with the rise of the Achaemenid Empire, led by Cyrus the Great, who conquered Babylon in the 6th century BCE. Although Cyrus is known for his relative tolerance toward local customs and religious traditions, including temple restorations, his reign also marked the beginning of the end for the dominance of traditional Mesopotamian theology. Under Achaemenid rule, Zoroastrianism began to spread across the empire, introducing new concepts such as cosmic dualism, individual judgment after death, and a universal ethical order, ideas that were foreign to Mesopotamian religious frameworks. In Babylon itself, temple rituals initially continued, and gods like Marduk were still honored. However, religious institutions slowly lost their political centrality. The priesthood, once aligned with kingship and empire, now had to negotiate its role under foreign rulers who did not share the same theological heritage. While local worship persisted, its influence faded. Temples no longer operated as administrative hubs, and kings no longer presented themselves as direct agents of the Mesopotamian gods. The conquest of Mesopotamia by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE introduced another wave of cultural change. The Hellenistic period, which followed his death, saw the fusion of Greek and Eastern traditions. Cities like Babylon and Seleucia became centers of Hellenistic religion and philosophy, where Greek deities were worshipped alongside or in place of Mesopotamian ones. While some elements of Mesopotamian belief were adapted into Greek thought, especially astrology and divination, the older myths lost much of their ritual and social function. One of the clearest signs of this transition is the gradual disuse of cuneiform script. The tablets that had for millennia preserved myths, rituals, prayers, and astronomical knowledge were replaced by Greek writing systems. As younger generations embraced new languages and literatures, the scribal schools that had trained priest scholars in the old ways disappeared. The great libraries of Nineveh and Babylon fell silent. Without scribes, the gods lost their voices. By the time of the Parthian and Sasanian periods, many of the great temples of Mesopotamia were abandoned or repurposed. Marduk's temple in Babylon, once the heart of the Akitu festival and symbol of divine kingship, stood in ruins. In some regions, older gods survived as syncretic figures, merged with new religious systems, or reimagined in local folklore. But the central structures, the rituals, priesthoods, and cosmic order of the ancient Mesopotamian religion had largely dissolved. However, decline does not mean disappearance. Elements of Mesopotamian thought survived and migrated, especially in the realms of astronomy, astrology, medicine, and magic. Greek and Roman scholars studied Babylonian star charts. The concept of mapping divine will through the heavens lived on in Hellenistic astrology, eventually influencing Roman, Islamic, and European systems. The Mesopotamian belief that fate could be read in the stars became a global legacy. Likewise, aspects of Mesopotamian myth found their way into other religious traditions. The flood story, first told through Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim, reappears in the Hebrew Bible with the figure of Noah. The Tower of Babel, a narrative preserved in the Book of Genesis, echoes the ziggurat traditions and cultural memory of Babylon's grandeur and confusion. While the theological meanings differ, the mythic structure and motifs reveal a clear lineage. The enduring themes of Mesopotamian mythology, cosmic order, divine kingship, human limitation, and the relationship between mortals and gods, continued to resonate long after the temples crumbled. Philosophical schools in the ancient Near East, from Zoroastrians to Gnostics, absorbed and reinterpreted these ideas. Even early Christian and Jewish thought engaged, consciously or unconsciously, with Mesopotamian questions about justice, destiny, and divine presence. In the modern world, the rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization in the 19th century sparked a renewed interest in its religious and mythological systems. Excavations at Nineveh, Ur, and Babylon, and the decipherment of cuneiform tablets brought the voices of the ancient gods back into scholarly and popular consciousness. The epic of Gilgamesh, once lost for over 2 millennia, returned as a masterpiece of world literature, a story that still speaks to the human fear of death and the search for meaning. Museums, universities, and researchers have since worked to preserve and interpret thousands of clay tablets containing hymns, rituals, medical texts, and epic tales. These texts are not merely historical curiosities. They offer insight into a worldview that shaped human civilization at its foundations. They remind us that religion is not static, but dynamic, adaptable to its cultural context, vulnerable to political shifts, and deeply embedded in daily life. And while the gods of Mesopotamia are no longer worshipped in temples, they have found new life in art, literature, and scholarship. They appear in novels, video games, films, and educational texts. They challenge modern readers to consider the roots of mythology, the evolution of belief, and the eternal questions that religion seeks to answer. The story of the decline of Mesopotamian religion is not one of simple erasure. It is a story of transformation. The gods did not vanish. They faded, merged, adapted, or were absorbed into new frameworks. Their stories endured, not through worship, but through memory. In many ways, Mesopotamian mythology continues to shape how we tell stories about the world. The battle between chaos and order, the burden of kingship, the struggle to understand death, the desire to interpret dreams and stars. These are not just ancient ideas. They are part of the human experience. The mythology of ancient Mesopotamia, shaped over the course of more than 3,000 years, did not end with the decline of its temples or the fall of its empires. Its gods, stories, and structures of belief did not vanish. Instead, they were absorbed, adapted, and echoed, quietly yet persistently, in the mythologies, philosophies, and religions that followed. Even today, the foundations of Mesopotamian myth continue to influence how humans think about creation, order, power, morality, and mortality. Among the clearest legacies is the direct transmission of mythic motifs into later traditions. The Mesopotamian flood story, first told through the characters of Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim, was retold with theological shifts in the Hebrew Bible, where Noah becomes the righteous survivor. The concept of a divine council, found throughout Mesopotamian myth, appears again in biblical narratives like the Book of Job or Psalms. The idea of humans created from clay, often mixed with divine substance, persists across multiple religious traditions, from Genesis to Quranic accounts of Adam. But beyond individual stories, it is the structure of myth that endures. Mesopotamian mythology laid out a way of seeing the world that centered on a few key ideas: that the cosmos is shaped by forces larger than human comprehension, that the role of humans is to maintain balance through duty, worship, and ethical conduct, that kingship, governance, and law are reflections of divine will, that death is inevitable, and understanding its meaning is part of what defines us. These were not abstract concepts in ancient Mesopotamia. They were embedded in daily life, in agriculture, architecture, politics, medicine, and family structure. Religion was not a compartmentalized belief system. It was the organizing logic of the world. Over time, these core ideas were transmitted, first to neighboring regions through trade, conquest, and cultural diffusion, then more broadly through the rise of empires and religions that inherited aspects of Mesopotamian cosmology. The Assyrians and Babylonians adapted older myths into state ideology. The Persians introduced ethical dualism but preserved elements of Mesopotamian governance and astronomy. The Greeks and Romans absorbed Near Eastern knowledge into their own intellectual traditions. Later still, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic texts would reflect, reinterpret, and respond to themes first articulated on Sumerian and Acadian tablets. Yet, while certain motifs were preserved, others were lost or fundamentally altered. Mesopotamian religion was focused not on salvation, but on stability. Its gods were not moral judges in the later theological sense. They were powerful, often unpredictable figures whose favor had to be maintained. There was no promise of eternal paradise or torment, only a shadowy afterlife where memory, not reward, preserved dignity. This view would change with later religions that emphasized divine justice, resurrection, and moral accountability. What also changed was the role of myth in public life. In Mesopotamia, mythology was not separate from governance. It legitimated law codes, justified political decisions, and explained disasters and successes alike. Over time, this fusion of myth and state weakened as religion became more personal, more philosophical, or more institutionalized in different forms. The grand integration of temple, city, cosmos, and king, so central to Mesopotamian civilization, gave way to more abstract, often universal models of faith. And yet, something still resonates. Modern society continues to grapple with many of the same questions that Mesopotamian myth sought to answer. Where do we come from? Why do we suffer? What forces shape our destiny? How should power be used? What does it mean to be human in a world that often feels unpredictable and beyond our control? Even now, we look to the stars for meaning, just as Mesopotamian priests did from their temple rooftops. We tell stories of divine beings, of floods, of sacred journeys, of death and rebirth. We build institutions based on written codes, argue over fate and free will, and search for wisdom in old texts. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Mesopotamian mythology reminds us of continuity within change. It shows how civilizations build on one another, not always through conquest or revolution, but through the quiet endurance of ideas. Myths change, names shift, rituals fade, but the fundamental human drive to explain and organize our world remains constant. The gods of Mesopotamia no longer receive offerings. Their temples lie in ruin, and their hymns are now studied rather than sung. But their voices still speak, through the stories we tell, the questions we ask, and the frameworks we use to understand power, justice, life, and death. To study Mesopotamian mythology is not only to explore the past, it is to uncover the early architecture of human thought. It is to see how myth shaped the first cities, the first laws, and the first sense of cosmic order. And in doing so, it offers not just knowledge of what was, but perspective on what continues to be. Continues to be.